Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to tonight's New Republic Salon series. We're very honored to have Rick Perlstein here, author of this newly published doorstop, Reaganland, which is the culminating, what do you call it? It's a tetralogy. It's the fourth volume in a series on the rise of modern conservatism. And it's very much the capstone, the moment when the conservative movement sort of becomes the dominant voice in American politics, courtesy of the rise of Ronald Reagan to the presidency. So we'll be discussing both Rick's new book, Rick's work in general, the parlous state of American democracy, and whatever else may be of interest to you, our collaborators in Zoom land, apropos of which you may, about 45 minutes into this discussion, we'll start taking questions, and you can submit them in the little Q&A icon sort of to the right of your Zoom display. So welcome, Mr. Perlstein. We're delighted to have you. It's a good time to be discussing all things Reagan as the 2020 presidential campaign kicks in earnest with the DNC this week. You know, I was going to joke that, well, as a treat to our readers, we'll just read the entirety of Reaganland. Since it weighs in at a brisk 1,100 or so pages. One of the things that struck me as I was reading and reliving this landmark moment in the conservative movement is how much of this book is actually about Jimmy Carter. You know, I think, and I guess one of my opening questions to you is, do you see the story you tell in this book as more the, you know, sort of coming of age moment for a, you know, conservative movement that had spent, you know, the last half century or so in the wilderness, or the collapse of the liberal consensus under the presidency of Jimmy Carter? What do you think is the more, you know, visceral story of those two through lines?
They're the same story, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no politics without conflict. You know, political situations, cultural situations are structured by their antinomies, by their conflicts, right?
Yeah,
and
almost as a, you know, sort of thought experiment, you know, another way of putting the question is, do you have, you know, Ronald Reagan seizing the moment with the authority he did without Jimmy Carter?
Right. Well, I think I will take that question in this direction. There was no foregone conclusion, I hope, that comes across in the book that Ronald Reagan would have gotten the Republican nomination, right? It was widely presumed that since he was so old and, you know, although, you know, nothing like the candidates we have now, but that was the discourse then,
Right.
And, you know, so extreme and so washed up, that even though he was, you know, the front runner just about the entire period the book covers, that he would fade at any time. So he attracted, Jimmy Carter attracted a large field of opponents. And the striking thing about it, I realized very early on, was that with the exception of John Anderson, which we can certainly talk about, TNR plays a fascinating role in the campaign, when it was misreported or when it was reported that he was considering Walter Cronkite for his running mate. All the candidates were running as conservatives, right? So one of my favorite things in the book was recovering the memory of a figure that was just dominated the discussion of American politics from the early 1960s until pretty much his flame out in this presidential election. And that's John Connally.
Right. He does a very clever thing where, you know, he, without naming the protagonist, he delivers a reader in the set piece of a, you know, very smooth, well-spoken, you know, presidential candidate in the 1980 cycle. He goes in and records, basically a live spot in the first take. Donors line up behind him, and you think you're reading about Ronald Reagan this whole time, and then Rick, sort of delivers the punchline that it's
right. And yes, the donors lined up behind him. He had like 100 Fortune 500 CEOs on his committee, something like that. They despised Ronald Reagan. They were terrified of Ronald Reagan. It took a lot of doing by William Casey and Ed Meese to bring the corporate elite on board, because he was seen as such a wild card, right? And John Connolly was even able to attract the loyalty of Richard Viguerie, right, the godfather of the New Right, and the Christian Right. Which he did, by trimming on abortion. So you had John Connolly, right? Fascinating figure. Right. He the only people who didn't like him, turns out, was the voters, but no one saw that. Right. And then, there's a very fascinating movement that basically brings down his campaign, even among the elites. And that's when he makes a proposal for peace in the Middle East that gives Arabs basically equal representation in the process. And the New York Times, the New Republic, Jewish groups go absolutely berserk. And that's it for John Connolly. But even George H.W. Bush, I tell a story about how I don't name which Reagan staffer it was, because that's a distraction. It was Roger Stone. Gave Jesse Helms a George H.W. Bush speech and a Phil Crane speech. And Phil Crane was the New Right candidate who was even to the right of Reagan. If you watch Mrs. America, they gave him a lot of airtime, right? And Jesse Helms, was it Jesse Helms? I think it was actually Orrin Hatch, guessed wrong about which one it is. So he was running as a conservative. And, there's this movement on the campaign trail where he's being bird dogged by anti-abortion activists at every stop. And he kind of mutters to himself, what am I going to do? Right. And Robert Novak says, change your position. So he does. And he comes out for a anti-abortion amendment to the Constitution, which was, the most extreme position a Republican could take. So he was running as a conservative. And James Baker is becoming more and more conservative. So whoever won, it was going to be a conservative. And that's why John Anderson decides, for one of the reasons John Anderson decides he's going to run as an independent, because he sees the party, slipping away from, the center of political life. So it's not necessarily the idea that Reagan is just like this kind of like towering dominant figure who shapes every, jot and tittle of the election. It's up in the air.
Here, and I think another really powerful argument of the book is that, yes, Reagan and this whole battery of Republican candidates veering to the right stand at the confluence of what you basically describe as a grievance industry.
Right.
A moment, when all of these figures are, and you just described in relation to abortion politics, are discovering these sort of key culture war.
Right. The New Right are basically the people who discover that, going after labor unions, going after the TVA, going after the social security gets them nowhere. It got Barry Goldwater nowhere. So they're like, look at things that are pissing people off about liberalism. And that's how Paul Weyrich, another one of these New Right figures, comes up with the slogan, sex is the Achilles heel of the liberal Democrats. Right. So they're basically, going around whooping up stuff about abortion, about homosexuality, basically eliminationist rage against gays. I mean, a lot of these figures, especially the preachers, were former segregationists, and they came around in segregation, but just seamlessly transferred that kind of sadistic monstrosity towards gays. There's Jerry Falwell at Anita Bryant rally in 1977 in Miami, saying a homosexual will just as soon look at you as he will kill you, right? So you got that going on. But then let's talk about Jimmy Carter for just a little bit, right? So one of the reasons I feel okay calling it Reaganland, even though it's not about the Reagan presidency, is, well, one, it's great branding, right?
I think as our reviewer of your book described all four of your books as sort of describing rides on a nightmarish theme park.
Yeah, Invisible Bridge. Yeah, Before the Storm. Yeah. But the reason I feel comfortable, centering a book about the rise of conservatism on the presidency of Jimmy Carter is because Jimmy Carter is very much part of this movement. He's this very strange figure who kind of seems to mark the end of one democratic regime and the coming of another. So Jimmy Carter, his campaign in 1976 was just like miraculously, wonderfully good. It so captured the moment of this post-Vietnam, we lost our first war, post-Watergate, we have a president who's a mafioso, and of course everyone remembers the slogan, I will not lie to you. And the striking thing about it was how good Jimmy Carter was at being all things to all people on the campaign trail. Right on chapter 1, I described Gerald Ford's ad man. And his name is Robert Teeter. He's not as famous as Patrick Cadell, but he was very innovative, and he was so I talk a lot about the pollsters, right? Because they seem to be the powers behind the throne. Ronald Reagan had a great one too. He has this thing where he basically plots out on clear acetate sheets voter results of all these polling questions, and each sheet is a different voter block. And Ford's advertising guy describes what it was like going into the office of a guy that everyone just called Mr. Cheney, who happens to have a man-sized safe where it says keep out on it. So Dick Cheney makes this, and it's in Cheney's office, and this guy Teeter just kind of lays one sheet over the other, and there's this wonderful poetic passage in which he's gun rights people clung to Jimmy Carter's feet. Suburban mothers clustered around him, liberals, George Wallace voters, labor voters, African Americans, and they're terrified because somehow this guy is able to be all things to all people. Now, what made the campaign so successful is partly the structure which makes his presidency so terrible, because he suddenly has to answer to all these different
right, exactly.
And one thing he never said on the campaign trail, in fact, he said quite the opposite. He promised, one of his campaign promises that Ronald Reagan recycled quite effectively in the debate was that he would never intentionally induce a recession to wring out inflation. Right. That's something Republicans do. But it turns out, and no one, some real buyer's remorse, he loves the idea of austerity. He loves the idea of budget cuts. He loves the idea of saying we're basically in a wartime situation and we have to sacrifice like our parents did in World War II. Paul Volcker is appointed almost accidentally, and his aides are begging Carter to distance himself from what they know Volcker is about to do, which is basically tie a noose around the economy, and which he does do and causes mass misery for years and years. And Jimmy Carter refuses to do it. He basically endorses him. So
he has a weird discipline fetish in office, I think.
He does. It's kind of like this guy who, if you've ever been to the Carter birthplace, in Plains, Georgia, which is wonderful. It's run by the Park Service. And, he even though his dad was pretty prosperous, he kind of grew up in this cabin. They tanned their own hides. They made their own maple sugar. Jimmy Carter, when he was like 8 years old, would walk a mile down the railroad tracks to sell boiled peanuts to people in town. So by the time he was went off to the Naval Academy, he had bought 3 houses that he used as investment properties, right? So he's Mr. Bootstraps. He's Mr. Hardscrabble. And he's like, this is what we need in our nation. And there's a lot of fascinating attraction to this. But when the alternative is
like the Republican candidate on that basis, right?
Well, except for the Republicans figure out a new way of running for president, right?
Really the story of the
this
book.
is where you get into the Jude Winniski thing, right? So Jude Winniski, you remember, was
I forget, he's still with us.
Could you forget? Is he still with us? He was a Wall Street Journal writer, and he was basically the main Leninist theorist of this claque of supply-side economists who basically made up this theory out of whole cloth. Right. Got Irving Kristol to run it in the public interest without any peer review or anything, claiming that they had proven that if you lower taxes, the economy takes off like a rocket. Just total horseshit, completely made up, no evidence whatsoever. But it sounds so good that politicians love it. And what Jude Winniski said is he called it the 2 Santa Claus theory. Right, that New Deal Democrats traditionally have this built-in advantage in any election. in that they can vote the public goodies from the public treasury.
Right.
You know, this is all the dams that Jimmy Carter, as his first major act in office, decides he's going to cancel without consulting with any of the people in whose districts these dams are. Judah Wanniski says, well, we have a Santa Claus too. It's across the board tax cuts. And, you know, Ronald Reagan takes to this like mother's milk. And that's his entire appeal. So if
you economics, you know,
and Jimmy Carter is also by 1980, after Afghanistan is, you know, running as a hawk, he says he's promising to increase the defense budget for 20%. So if you want a hawk, you know, you might as well vote for the guy who's going to put money in your pocket instead of the guy who promises to take it out of your pocket.
Yeah, no, it is a weird moment of cross-dressing, ideologically speaking, where, you know, the Austerians are the Democrats, and, you know, Carter, who you describe very aptly throughout the book as, you know, an engineer. He views every problem of governance as kind of a scientific exercise in arriving at, you know, the perfect solution, and then instructing the public on what it is and making the public adhere to it.
With absolutely no consultation with any of the politicians and whose, you know, constituencies
who are directly affected, or the constituencies who are affected. And
my favorite Jimmy Carter story is something from his diary when he complains that Congress has just passed a law giving him the obligation to appoint like 200 new federal judges. It's like, why did they do this to me? Right? Any other president would be like, I have the chance to shape the federal judiciary for a generation.
Yeah, no, Mitch McConnell would not have that response, right?
No, any other president, right?
Or any president, yes, exactly.
So, you know, that's not what the public thought that they were voting for.
No, it's true. And it's also striking. I had forgotten the extent to which the media turned on Carter really savagely.
Well, yeah, that's the other thing, yeah.
Yeah,
so I mean, you have, you know, on the one hand, you have Jerry Brown, who he comes out after Proposition 13 and gives his State of the State speech in January of 1979 and promises that he's going to work for a federal balanced budget amendment. And it's so extreme that like Barry Goldwater and Robert Bork are like,
yeah, hold on.
This is nuts.
Right.
And the people who are like have been advocating stealthily in state legislators to get 3/4 of state legislatures to approve this, like completely under the radar, complain because then they're like suddenly this issue is out in the open and we're not going to be able to, you know, we're not going to be able to get this by subterfuge.
Yeah.
Right. So you have Jerry Brown. You know, I found a video of him at the News Archive in Vanderbilt. That you can see if you look up an interview I did with Mark Blythe, in which there's an expose about deaths that are happening in the mental hospitals in California.
Right.
And the doctors are all like, yeah, well, Reagan's budget cuts were terrible, but Jerry Brown's were worse. And the reporter's like, well, Governor Brown, what do you say to that? And he says, well, everyone's just gonna have to make do with less. You know, my job is to give people, to disappoint people. So this is the Democratic Party, right? And then
I know.
The thing is, every time Carter turns the screw more tightly, the media says, well, he's not really serious about this. He's not doing it enough. And they literally are bashing Jimmy Carter for not asking for sacrifice from the public.
Right, which is, you know, arguably his biggest political flaw.
So he's basically, I like to say that Jimmy Carter is a guy who couldn't win for losing, you know.
No,
he opens up Cuba, so, you know, so Fidel Castro lets, you know, thousands of people to, you know, to take rickety boats to Florida, and suddenly it's all Jimmy Carter's burden, right?
Yeah, no, it is absolutely true. And it is, you know, that I think it's proper that he does. I think if you're to do a analysis, he probably occupies more real estate in the book. Because, you know, I think to a striking extent, we're still living in the aftermath of both Jimmy Carter's world and Ronald Reagan's world. And we're seeing, you know, right now, we were discussing before we went live, you know, there was some reporting that senior Biden advisors are already saying, look, you know, when we get to the Oval Office, the cupboard's going to be bare. So we have to prepare for more sacrifice. It's a very, you know.
Well, it's crazy, right? I mean, it's like there's always going to be a new intellectual excuse for starving the coffers, right? I mean, what's absolutely tragic, and I say that this is the only part of the book that made me cry when I was writing about it, other than the assassination of Harvey Milk and Dan White getting off because the city of San Francisco, through the case, is writing about Volcker, writing about Carter, and writing about all these people who are insisting that you have to cut the budget because that's the only way to fight inflation. Now, if you think about that tragedy, now we have no inflation and massive budget deficits, right? So all that misery, the complete destruction of America's industrial might for a fantasy, right? I mean, it's almost like a John Birch style conspiracy for the amount of accuracy it had.
That is.
Anyway, let's talk about Star Wars. No, I'm just kidding.
Right now, I was going to ask the Superman question.
Yeah.
Which isn't, and it's, one of the things I love about all your books is that they're, and you've written this, I think, for me, that you have presidents on the cover, but the books are really about the country and sort of broader shifts in, the political culture, how America's self-understanding goes through these, manic twists and turns. And one of the things you highlight here is rebooting the Superman movie franchise, which I think that was like the first big modern superhero blockbuster, right?
Well, it was definitely the apotheosis to that point of this new model of doing business in Hollywood. One of the fun things about writing about Reagan is I got to study Hollywood, right? And so I got to study the whole, with the Invisible Bridge, I talk about the star system. So you have this massive industry that's completely based on popular taste. And it's unlike any widget in, the industrial, shed, in that you have to try to make steady revenue based on completely fickle popular taste. And the way Hollywood from generation to generation has solved this problem, in the 20s, they invent the star system, right? Which basically means you go to a Clara Bow movie, or a John Wayne movie, and you know exactly what you're going to get, the studios groom people to be off the screen just like they are off the screen. There's a whole publicity apparatus behind this, that breaks down thanks to the antitrust actions. And, long story short, by the 1960s, they're so crazy that they decide, they're so desperate that they decide, what if we try making movies that have artistic merit?
Right.
So they give all this money to young directors like Martin Scorsese, right? And you get these like super morally ambiguous adult movies that kind of ape European art cinema, like, Taxi Driver or Last Tango in Paris, which make money. Or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which won every Oscar, in 1976. But then suddenly you get Jaws, right? And that's Steven Spielberg. And it's this huge hit, and they open it up in thousands of mall theaters at the same time with tons of commercials. That's completely new, no word of mouth, none of that stuff. And then comes Rocky the next year, and Victor Camby in the Times says this is absolute, Capra-esque crap. But it beats, Road to Glory and One Flew Over, and not One Flew Over the Cuckoo's, excuse me, All the President's Men for the Oscar. Right. And then the next year you get Star Wars. And George Lucas was one of these young artistic directors. He made his dystopian science fiction movie. It went nowhere. And he says, I'm going to make a children's movie. The kids know it needed to right from wrong. And you were, a little older than me, but, this was a children's movie. When I was 7 years old, we traded Star Wars cards. Right. And then the next year, the reason I say Superman was the apotheosis of this was I mentioned somewhere down the road that, by 1980, it's all sequels, right? Because they have what they call now franchises, right? Intellectual property. The thing about Superman that was so interesting, besides the content, which we can get into, is that they filmed both the original film and the sequel at the same time and then released it the next year. So that's how kind of canned, and, this is Reaganism too, right? This is this idea that basically we have to create these myths and make a lot of money off it. Now, the thing that's really striking about the plot of Superman is that the way they do the movie is Superman grows up in this bucolic town, Smallville. He is basically the Norman Rockwell family. And then he is called, to the Fortress of Solitude. And then he comes back to civilization, basically having skipped the 60s, right? And he comes back, but he's still the 50s. And he's wearing his Trilby hat and his boxy suit and his glasses. And everyone's laughing at him. He's at the newspaper. And the really mind-blowing thing that I think New Republic readers will really appreciate is if you watch Superman and you watch All the President's Men, the newspaper scenes in Superman are like shot for shot remakes of All the President's Men. And it's literally a redemption of the darkness and cynicism of All the President's Men. You know, with Lois Lane standing in for Woodward and Bernstein. She's this hardened cynic, and she's this hard bitten, and she's like, she will not fall for Clark Kent. She will not fall for Superman, but she's swept over when she says, "What are you here for?" This is very much like this Christ-like thing. And he says, to fight for truth, justice, and the American way. And the audience laughed, and she laughed, right? But by the end of the movie,
they're won over, yeah.
And then suddenly you have the Steve Bannon situation where culture is downstream from politics, right? And you have people willing to buy tickets for a Reagan-like movie before they're willing to vote for someone like Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, no, it is a perfect, set piece capturing this, very gradual, critical.
That chapter is the one about John Connolly.
Yes. I also wanted to touch on a subject that's dear to both our hearts. You write at great length, and I remember you driving me around Chicago with the transcript from this IRS, landmark IRS hearing that I think we both would argue over and above abortion politics is the sort of moment of the Christian rights, coming into full political self-awareness.
It's their Pentecost, I say.
Yeah, Pentecost. It really has the feel and, language of a revival. And this is something I studied obsessively, as you know.
Right.
And
as you know, it's the money cult, because this is basically, well, should we rewind a little bit and give a little set piece for the good people?
The underpinnings of this whole episode.
Right. So basically, Brown versus Board of Education passes, nothing happens, right? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 says you're not going to get any federal money if your school segregates, is not integrated, nothing happens, right? So basically, the Supreme Court gets involved. There's a case in 1969, there's a case in 1970, there's a case in 1971. Each one kind of, tightening the ratchet on segregationist schools at a time in which groups like the White Citizens Councils, right, in Mississippi and Alabama are literally opening parallel school systems that are, but in name, public school systems, right? That are meant to be the school system for the white people, and then relegating the black people to the private schools. Now, the public schools, which of course rot because they don't get aid because they don't have as big population. The thing about it is there's a parallel development in time, and a lot of people get this wrong, that fundamentalist evangelical Christians open their own schools. Right. And there's an overlap with this, what they call the segregation academies. But a lot of these were segregation academies were often like real public school systems, except where they weren't called public school systems. Right. A lot of these things were in like church basements. They were in empty shacks. There were also very big school systems that were run by ministers. Tim LaHaye had his own school system in San Diego. Yeah. But they were often integrated. And in fact, I give the example of one school that Jerome, the previous IRS director, was hired as a consultant to integrate this school and to study it. And he did a social science study, and he basically found out that Black people wanted to go to public schools because they'd put their bodies on the line to go to public schools, right? So there was no will on the part of African Americans to go to these schools. So they had very few African American students. And so Jimmy Carter's IRS director, completely independent of Jimmy Carter, basically tightens the rules and says, look, you need this percentage of students or else you're going to get stricter scrutiny. There were very poorly designed rules. And one of the things that's very interesting about this is the coalition against it included like Montessori
schools, right? Yeah. Oh, Rick is frozen. But I guess I can take up the story. So what happens once this IRS rule is promulgated, it basically takes away the tax deduction for these new evangelical schools, and there's a mass uprising. The White House is flooded with, I think, upward of 1 million telegrams protesting this. The IRS holds hearings about the rule change, and evangelicals come from all across the country. And it is not like any other hearing about a government rule change you can imagine. There are people, sort of giving, fervid testimony in a religious sense to, their sense that they are Christian martyrs in the modern age, that they're coming, and Rick is back. I was just taking up the narrative from where you left off.
I wonder if you missed. No, I'm just kidding.
I got it to the hearing.
There's this big hootenanny of a hearing, and I said there's never been an administrative hearing like this. It's basically like a revival.
I just said exactly that. But yeah.
And you get these ministers who come from as far away as Alaska,
yep.
And they're basically saying they're willing to die, willing to go to jail, to have the right to run their schools the way they want. And they're basically one of the crazy legends that spreads in the Christian community, spread also by Orrin Hatch, by the way, is that this was all about forcing schools to have sodomites as teachers.
Right. So again, this is the overlapping grievance theory that is so,
yes. And one of the important things I'd say is that even though, and one of the reasons that their rage was so, concentrated was partly it was the money, right? Partly it was, they were being accused of this abiding civic sin of racism. And one of them says, well, this is like basically you're called into the dock for witnessing a crime that you weren't involved in. And I'm sure like a lot of these people were racist. Bob Jones was one of the people who testified, but a lot of them were, not,
it was a very blunt argument.
Because they were basically, their whole raison d'etre was to remove kids from the civic life of the nation and educate them in this bubble in which everything that was happening outside of the conservative Christian world was
corrupt and fallen.
Right? Yeah. Terrible, satanic. By the way, do you know how I managed to track down? I read one of the articles, and a woman named Peg Griffin was the one who, after the congressman spoke on the first day, she bolted out a receipt and said, "Are we going to get to speak?" Right. So I interviewed her for like 45 minutes.
Yeah. Wow.
Did I play you the interview?
No, I think you.
The reason I realized that she was still around was because she was on the Daily Show.
Really?
She was the butt of they did those. They would always do those interviews in which they would. She was working to get a statue put up of William Jennings Bryan in place for the scope. So I tracked her down and I interviewed her.
Right.
And she said she heard that they were going to force her Christian school to accept sodomite teachers, and which was one of these, manic Leninist, completely devoted activists that took the political world by storm, precisely because these people had not been involved in electoral politics before, right?
Yeah, and I think that's crucial. They see, these alliances in fundamentally different ways. They do have this sort of Manichaean worldview.
Right. And by the way, that book that I showed you, the reason it's such a fascinating document, it came out like a couple of years later. It has all the transcripts. It literally is presented as a sacred text.
Yeah.
It's
a present at the creation sort of moment for the evangelical right, and it's crazy because no one writes about it.
Yeah, well, they write about it wrong.
Right,
but
exactly.
One of the things I point out about it is that all these preachers saying they're willing to die. The year before, I have an account of all these preachers coming to Concord, New Hampshire, and basically saying that this rickety school that didn't pass all the building codes, that they were going to descend in the millions on Concord, New Hampshire if they didn't let this school open because they can't answer to secular authorities. I mean, this is really extremist radical stuff that builds this plank of the Reagan coalition. You have all these
I think
they're willing to die
in this connection. That, fast forward 40 some years, and what is the most sturdy plank of the Trump movement? The exact same people.
Making the same arguments, which people.
The same arguments. And, and this is sort of the big question for we in the House of Liberalism is,
how do you
know by now, the sort of toxic power of this accumulation of grievance politics.
Right.
How are liberals able to counter this? What is the story? I mean, in a way, your whole tetralogy or whatever the term is is the story of how the fringe conservative movement, merges with
Liberals used to have these organizations that, much like churches, kind of met in the same place at the same time, organizing people, for political action.
right. And while liberals had churches,
there were unions.
What's that?
There were unions.
Yeah,
right?
there were unions as well.
And one of the things I described Jimmy Carter doing is completely lying flat in his back as, labor law reform was absolutely steamrolled by this corporate coalition that I describe as the boardroom Jacobins.
Right, the boardroom Jacobins, which is also another fascinating, Ralph Nader, who a lot of contemporary people think of as this evildoer in the 2000 election.
And reading my book, why he probably saved your life a time or two.
Right. And he became this sort of rock star figure, not just,
he gets host Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Host Saturday Night Live surrounded him like he was a rock star.
It's really true. And he had, I forget the guy's name now, but there was a Naderite head of the FTC under Carter who became this.
Michael Pertschuk. I'm hoping to make him a household name.
Yeah, this is your chance. But who became a lightning rod of, eventually the people you call the boardroom Jacobins, the sort of, I guess, dialectical result of Nader's, storming the political culture is the CEOs at the head of these industries, the automotive industries, the airline industries, all these big businesses that are now being targeted as enemies of the people decide, holy shit, we have to,
the way I describe it is that they become class conscious.
It's absolutely true. And that's why, the coinage boardroom Jacobin is pitch perfect.
Thank you, sir. The way corporate lobbying kind of worked up to this point during like the Trente Glorieuses, when business was, going up and up and up, was basically zero-sum lobbying. It was kind of, Pratt and Whitney and Lockheed, lobbying to get the same contract.
Right, and they're getting market share and at that point, they're also, still in the world of the New Deal social contract where, they're getting contracts that they will then, in a very broad way trickle down and, they're not, looking to maximize shareholder value with every breath they take.
That's right.
But I think
people who are looking to maximize revenue in the business world are the smaller, more tenuous organizations that are kind of like the closely held family companies in the Midwest who are kind of seen as these Neanderthal reactionaries. And interestingly enough, it's the blue chip companies that join the Neanderthals. These guys there's literally a meeting of the business roundtable in which they're trying to decide whether to endorse this labor law reform, which, by the way, they had helped write. And the CEO here is just like, we got to join this coalition of all these like foundry owners in the Midwest, these Goldwaterites, because the future survival of capitalism, depends on it. I mean, people are familiar with the Powell memo. This is basically what we're talking about.
Right. And this is where the Powell memo becomes,
And after these people reject John Connally, they reluctantly gather around Reagan.
Yeah, and that is another, the sort of way in which, another big narrative through line of the book is how Reagan makes himself palatable to the business establishment.
By hiding how crazy he is.
Right, and the piece you wrote,
and the New Republic.
Yeah, the piece you wrote for us, which I urge everyone to go to the TNR site and read, is about this very canny letter writing campaign where, this is not unusual. Reagan's aides sort of.
Right, not unusual, right? But what's unusual is how far they were from the extremist views he actually held as revealed in letters he dictated to people like Gene Dixon, the newspaper psychic.
Right, exactly.
My favorite example of this, so he had this kind of handler, Mike Deaver, who, was very close to him since the 60s. And he was on the outs with Reagan for various reasons while Reagan was in the White House. And a story broke that Reagan had said that South Africa had transcended their race problem much better than we had in America. And Mike Deaver in his memoir says he immediately knew that he must have done an interview while on his ranch. And that if you really know Reagan, you cannot have him do an interview on his ranch, especially if he has to be sitting down, right?
Has to be focused.
And, you need the care and feeding of Ronald Reagan is, I like to think that even though this isn't about the Reagan presidency, this is a toolkit. There's nothing in the Reagan presidency you can't understand from hearing about this. So a huge part of what happened in the Oval Office, it was basically keeping the crazy Reagan under wraps, which he was perfectly willing to do because he was good at, kind of taking direction, right?
He's an actor, right?
and sticking to the speeches. I quote him in an interview in 1980 saying, no one remembers what Abraham Lincoln did. They just remember his speeches, right? So that's what he cared about the most, right? He's the great communicator.
Right. And the other piece of that that's really interesting, and I totally forgotten about, was there was also an effort to present, kind of Ronald Reagan unplugged in the first
Reagan
batch.
be Reagan.
Let Reagan be Reagan, right? And these very, and I've been thinking of those ads in connection. I'm sure you've seen the Republican voters for Biden ads that are these same kind of, just, iPhone, production values, very simple testimonials. I'm a lifelong Republican, but I reached my limit. I'm voting for Joe Biden. And I think it's that same quality of what appears to be an unvarnished, we should again back up and explain.
Well, really the trick to being a successful politician is sincerity. And if you can fake that, you got it made.
That's absolutely true. So, but yes.
I tell that story.
Yeah, tell us about those ads, because I think that's a tipping point.
So the Reagan campaign was so poorly run. We could talk about this guy, John Sears, and,
right. Right. That's a whole.
That would be an interesting digression. But anyway, they were so broke and so poorly managed by the time the New Hampshire primary rolled around that they basically couldn't afford their Madison Avenue advertising agency, which is the guy. I think he came up with 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Trident, I forget who, but it was Bell. It was Jeff Bell, who just passed away 2 years ago. I did not know that. He was very helpful to me. Very nice guy, supply side economist who won a Senate nomination from New Jersey in 1978. And his commercials were done by this guy from Philadelphia who happened to be a liberal named Elliot Curson. And he's like this, Jeff Bell's like, you should get this guy Curson. And Reagan liked him. He had a very insouciant wit. And Elliot Curson is a guy I've struck up a great correspondence and dialogue with. And he went to California and he watched Reagan in action and he was very impressed. And one of the things he kind of intuited was the exact same thing that Reagan's campaign came up with through really the most remarkably massive focus group research in the history of presidential campaigning for the general election after this guy Elliot Curson had been fired, which was that if you presented Ronald Reagan with Klieg lights, with swelling music, all the stuff we associate with the Morning America commercial in 1984, people will think he's just an actor.
Right.
But if you sit him down in a chair and have him, basically in a Zoom call, with a bunch of books behind him, just talking about what he did as governor, not accurately, by the way, that you could win people's trust. And he came up with a brilliant series of ads. One of them was called the Good Shepherd ad, in which he talked about how much he cared about the poor and how supply side economics was the best way to help the poor, and that liberalism was just robbing people with taxes, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of conservatives went berserk about this. There's a great letter from Jude Wanniski complaining to the Reagan campaign that they shouldn't listen to these people, right? That this is really the way you're gonna win the election. But the fact that Ronald Reagan had these very unaffected ads is, pretty striking, right? He no makeup, no lights, and that's
and conveyed
the general election too.
Right, and it conveyed the idea that he was a serious,
not crazy.
He was not crazy.
Right. He was not crazy, right?
Which was brilliant.
Brilliant. And he, basically after George Bush won the Iowa caucus, the political press, who had no faith in Reagan and had been writing him off, had a celebration basically about how prescient they were. Right. And, then came the New Hampshire primary and the famous debate in which he, quoted a Spencer Tracy movie and humiliated Bush. And you got to read the book. It's a lot of fun.
Yes, absolutely. And that is a good note to end on. This is Reaganland by Rick Perlstein. It'll trust me, it goes much more quickly than you might
Rick
think.
says there's not a wasted word, so I was very pleased with that.
It's true. I'm an editor, and I agree. It's you'll laugh, you'll cry. So I would like to open the floor now to some questions. Let's see. So let's start with a question from Ralph Carmona. Reviewing the 1960s to the days of Reagan, where do you see the whole question of intersectionality, which seems to have congealed as a majority opposed in this era of Trumpism?
Well, that's kind of interesting because we talk about intersectionality as a theory of, identity that, basically means that people have multiple identities and that people's position in the pecking order, can be, there's more oppression for people who kind of have more oppressed identities, right? And it's about thinking about these intersections, right? One of the fascinating things about how intersectionality worked on the right, you might say, is that when it came to these issues, they call them social issues, basically all these kind of very emotional issues, gun control, abortion, gay rights, anti-feminism, they were dismissed by pundits as single issue voters, single issue movements, right? But they really weren't. And one of the things I say is that each new grievance with the same target, which is liberals, that was kind of stirred into the stew, actually ended up increasing the operational unity, right, of the right-wing coalition. So really, when someone came up with a new thing that people were angry at, people were always on the right perfectly glad to kind of glom onto this as another thing to be mad about, right? So it functioned quite differently than on the left, in which you have these coalitions that are kind of often at loggerheads with each other.
Fragmenting. That's the key, I think, is the right sort of. I don't know how they arrived at this insight, but we're able to mint intersectionality into ideology, which then works to bind together.
I mean, people say, there's a kind of a standard narrative, which, only really works if you use only intellectuals as your evidence, that in order for conservatism to succeed as a political movement, you required a fusion, right? So for example, business conservatives and Christian conservatives, that actual intellectual work had to be done in order to get them to keep from fighting with each other. That is not true. No. Right? I mean, even if you were not a person of faith, if you were, say, an Irving Kristol, you respected the necessity of religion as basically a way to kind of order the universe, to kind of keep people online.
As Kristol is reputed to have said, we need evangelicals to keep the goyim in line.
Quite epigrammatic. Was that in one of his Wall Street Journal columns? I don't think so.
No, I think it was, yeah.
So you have this guy like Irving Kristol, who is completely welcoming to the Christian right because they serve his ideological purpose at the same time as he's organizing quite, he wrote an op-ed saying people need to, corporations need to donate money to conservative groups, not, kind of charities. And jokes, well, he didn't give his phone number, but he might as well have.
He might as well have, yeah.
Which he didn't have to, because he was already on the board of all these corporations, right?
Here's another question from Jeffrey Stutz, asking, to what degree in 1980 did the body politic need the rhetoric of American exceptionalism after suffering through Watergate, the energy crisis, and most glaringly, the Iran hostage crisis, which I think this gives you an opportunity to do a little bit of debunking, I think, so.
Yeah, the rhetoric of American exceptionalism. Well, of course, you can also cant the rhetoric of American exceptionalism in a progressive direction, right? That America is the place that in which new groups are kind of folded into the ambit of liberalism and get full recognition and full rights in a way that they haven't always in other places, right? Maybe it's a myth, right? But these are all myths, right?
Yeah, so useful.
So it's, American exceptionalism is not necessarily a, reactionary thing. I mean, one of the things I write about in my last book, Invisible Bridge, is how the period during and after Watergate midwife a very powerful and very well articulated liberal patriotism, which was about, kind of holding elites to account, as opposed to Reagan patriotism, which was all about arguing that America was already the greatest country in the world and didn't need to examine anything, right? So, this goes to basically my theory about how body politics become healthy. And it's not by denying conflict and denying ordeals and denying problems, but actually recognize them and working through them, like, South Africa did, like Germany did, after World War II. And that if you just sort of say America's the greatest country in the world and they can't do any wrong, you might sweep those problems under the rug, but you basically are creating repressions that return with more violence and vociferousness than they would have in the absence of the hard work of reconciliation. So I would reject that premise.
And I also was wondering if you wanted to say a little about the Iran hostage crisis, which I think in retrospective accounts is, sort of.
I learned that the one thing, I like to joke that everyone knows like 5 or 6 things about every presidential election and 3 or 4 of them are wrong, right? Right. So one of the things I learned from this was that NBC and the New York Times did an exit poll, massive exit poll, 13,000 interviews in 1980. And one of the things they discovered was that the Iran-Contra issue was the 4th most.
The Iranian hostage crisis.
That's the Iran-Contra. The fact that Iran took all the people inside the American embassy hostage in November of 1979, and they were held until, January of 1981. But that for people who named it their top issue, who said the most important thing for me as an American, and the reason I'm voting for who I'm voting for is the Iran hostage crisis, Carter won those people by a margin of 2-1.
Yeah.
Which is completely, everyone thinks that Reagan won because Carter let the hostages be taken.
Right. And there was the October surprise theory, all the Gary Sick stuff. But yeah, that was a shocking statistic to come across.
I hope that people, take that to heart. And the fact of the matter is his approval ratings were absolutely, post-malaise speech in the toilet, and they never went that low again. And people rallied around the flag. And I think that Jimmy Carter actually handled the hostage crisis quite effectively, and his statesmanship was quite careful, and none of them were harmed. Right. They weren't, tortured to any great degree, and people were terrified. As the joke put it, what's green and glows, right? I put that one on one of the last pages. I was told that by a guy who was, around at the time. He said the punchline is Tehran, right, 15 seconds after Ronald Reagan's inauguration. So I think people were really, people were terrified of Ronald Reagan. No. I think he got such a free pass from the press because once he became president and, his craziness was held in check, they were like, oh, maybe he's not so bad after all.
Right. And the hostages were released the day after he was inaugurated. So,
right.
An anonymous attendee wants to know.
While he was inaugurated.
Yes, wow.
Split screens.
Yeah, that's right. An anonymous writer wants to know if you plan to write a book about the 80s. I already know the answer to this, but you can.
I don't. I think, I was so, sentient during the 1980s, that I don't know how I would discipline myself, but I have other plans, and I've always conceptualized this book as a series that goes from the 1964 election to the 1980 election. And I do a heck of a lot of journalism on contemporary politics in historical context. So you can hear a lot about what I think about stuff that didn't happen in the 70s and 60s. And if you kind of Google me and Donald Trump.
Yes, well, speaking of Donald Trump, I think this is probably a good note to go out on. How do you see, we're in, that we see now routine forecasts of, the death of the Republican Party. And
right, just like in 1964.
Exactly.
In 1992, and just like in 2008. Liberals believe in the kind of progress and reason, and once people once progress vanquishes unreason, people think it's paid for good, and it's never true. Reaction is just part of our birthright as Americans.
No, it's absolutely true. And you would think, you would hope Donald Trump would, represent the end point of grievance politics. There's no place for it to go from here. It is.
Well, I have grievances.
No, well, that's another question.
America, you can fire anyone for any reason. I'm really mad, that corporations, run a. I think we need, obviously, there's no social democratic politics without, grievance properly understood.
Yes, and that was one of my questions is, how, given, all these things we've been talking about, the fact that, the evangelical, Pentecost has lasted 40 years, creating reactionary politics. What is the story, you've told the story, as I was saying earlier, of how the conservative movement became the American story. What is a story that liberals most need to tell at this moment? Not merely to defeat the bad man, to have an empathetic good man in the presidency, but to actually, give an affirmative portrait of what a good society is, what the role of government, of,
No, I think it's government is good. I think it's, not, I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. Ronald Reagan famous most dangerous 7 words in the English language, I think has been revealed in our interlocking ordeals as an absolute imperative, right? And it's not like, government is the be all and the end all of a good society, but there's some things only government can do. Paul Krugman says, a nation is an army and an insurance company and an army, right? The only way that we can kind of insure Americans against the risk of everyday life in a capitalist society is by basically socializing the risk, by spreading it around, right? And that's what government is all about. And hopefully this...
I guess my question is, how do you make that as visceral as, I'm going to die for my evangelical school? How
you make it visceral that unless the government tells people, unless the government makes rules that protect the common good, you're going to die from COVID-19.
Well, that is indeed what is happening.
The hanging tends to concentrate the mind, as
Samuel Johnson said.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess, well, actually we have time for one more question. So here's one from Jeremy Cohen. I'm currently rereading Nixonland. I know that Rick rejects direct parallels between Nixon and Trump, but what about parallels between Trump and George Wallace?
Well, I like to say history is process, not parallels, right? And, there is a figure that's successful in American politics by using the tools that George Wallace used in the 1960s and 1970s. And there was also a figure in American politics who was successful using the tools of George Wallace and Donald Trump in the 1830s and 40s, named John C. Calhoun, right? Yeah. So, this is just part of American life. A lot of what people recognize as parallels are just kind of universals of the human and or American experience. Right. So there have always been reactionaries in American politics. There's always been people who have kind of weaponized the basest fears in the most, anti-social ways. And there maybe always will be, because it's a really convenient way to kind of seize and hold power. So you cannot understand Donald Trump without understanding all these people. Right. But not because, there's somehow some sort of, kind of a pendulum that swings back and forth, but that's just part of what America is.
All right, well, an equally depressing note on which to end. So thank you very much, Rick Perlstein.
We shall overcome, Chris.
What's that?
We shall overcome.
Yes, absolutely. From your lips to God's ears, as we say in the Midwest. Thanks once more for having us. Once again, the book is Reaganland. It will well reward your time, especially in this difficult moment in our politics. So thank you once again, and good night.